At 5:30 hours on January 5, 1943, Lieutenant William "Red" Cochrane stood in the aft fire control station aboard the USS Helena, watching four dark shapes materialize through the pre-dawn haze off Cape Hunter, Guadalcanal. The shapes resolved into Aichi D 3A dive bombers, Japanese Vals, banking toward the American task force with practiced precision. Cochrane commanded 12 5-inch guns on Helena's stern. In the ammunition lockers directly below his position sat crates of shells marked with red bands and stamped with a code name the crew had been forbidden to discuss: VT fuse, variable time. These shells contained something the Imperial Japanese Navy's best engineers had declared technologically impossible: a miniature radar transmitter and receiver packed into a space smaller than a beer can, designed to survive being fired from a cannon at 20,000 times the force of gravity, and programmed to detonate 70 feet from an enemy aircraft without requiring a direct hit. The Pentagon had classified the VT fuse at the same security level as the atomic bomb project. If a dud shell fell into enemy hands, Japanese engineers might reverse engineer the technology or develop countermeasures that could devastate American naval operations across the Pacific. Using them without explicit authorization from Admiral Halsey could result in a court-martial. But Cochrane had authorization. 500 rounds of proximity-fused shells had been delivered to Helena in October 1942. The ship's gunnery officers had received special training. They had been told these shells would change naval warfare forever. They had also been told to use them only over water, where duds would sink beyond recovery. That this morning, 4 Japanese dive bombers were approaching his ship. Cochrane gave the order, fire. The 5-inch guns roared. 3 shells screamed toward the departing Vals at 2,800 feet per second. Inside each shell, a circuit powered by a battery activated by the firing shock began transmitting radio waves at 90 million cycles per second. When those waves reflected off metal surfaces nearby, the receiver circuit detected the change in signal strength and triggered the detonator. 70 feet from the lead valve, the first proximity fuse shell detonated in midair. The valve disintegrated in a ball of flame and fell burning into the Solomon Sea. What Lieutenant Cochrane did not know was that he had just achieved the first combat kill using a proximity fuse against an enemy aircraft. What the Japanese pilots in the remaining 3 Vals did not know was that they had just witnessed a weapon their own scientists had concluded was impossible to build. This is the story of how American physicists created a device that could think faster than human reflexes, how that technology remained secret for 3 years, and how it killed more Japanese aircraft than any other anti-aircraft weapon in the Pacific War. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you're watching from today. The problem started at Pearl Harbor on December the 7th, 1941. When 126 Aichi D 3A Val dive bombers participated in the Japanese attack on the Pacific Fleet that morning, American anti-aircraft guns threw up thousands of shells equipped with timed fuses. These fuses were supposed to detonate at specific altitudes, creating walls of shrapnel that enemy aircraft would fly through. The system required gunners to estimate the altitude and speed of incoming aircraft, calculate the time of flight for each shell, set the fuse mechanically, and hope the aircraft hadn't changed altitude or direction by the time the shell arrived. It almost never worked. Of the 48 civilians killed at Pearl Harbor that day, most died when improperly fused American anti-aircraft shells exploded on impact with the ground in downtown Honolulu instead of detonating in the air near Japanese attackers. The shells that did explode at altitude rarely hit anything. The statistics were devastating. In the worst cases, during the early war period, gunners fired 2,500 shells for every enemy aircraft destroyed. Even under optimal conditions, hitting a fast-moving dive bomber at altitude with time-fused shells was nearly impossible. The Japanese Val dive bomber was not fast by fighter standards. Its maximum speed was 242 miles per hour, slow enough that American fighter escorts had to fly zigzag patterns to avoid overtaking them. But Vals were exceptionally maneuverable for bombers, and their pilots were among the most skilled in any air force on Earth. In training, experienced Val pilots could place bombs within a 10-meter circle from a 70-degree dive. In combat against the British cruisers Cornwall and Dorsetshire in April 1942, Japanese Val squadrons achieved better than 80% hit accuracy. Against the aircraft carrier Hermes during the same operation, the hit rate was similar. This was not luck. This was precision that came from intensive training, disciplined tactics, and aircraft designed specifically for accurate dive bombing. The Val's design incorporated lessons learned from German Stuka dive bombers and American naval aircraft. Its elliptical wings, inspired by the Heinkel He-70, provided excellent lift characteristics during steep dives. Hydraulic dive brakes under the wings allowed pilots to maintain control during near-vertical attacks without exceeding safe speeds. The bomb release mechanism swung ordnance clear of the propeller arc even in steep dives. An automatic pull-up system ensured the aircraft recovered from dives even if the pilot blacked out from high G forces. Most importantly, the Val was small. Its wingspan was just over 47 feet. Its fuselage length was 33 feet. From the perspective of an anti-aircraft gunner trying to hit it with a time-fused shell, the Val was a needle-sized target moving at over 350 feet per second, capable of changing altitude by thousands of feet in seconds during its attack dive. American anti-aircraft gunners faced an impossible problem. Traditional doctrines said to establish a defensive barrage, a zone of exploding shells that aircraft had to fly through to reach their target. But creating an effective barrage required knowing where the aircraft would be when the shells arrived. For level bombers flying straight courses at constant altitude, fire control officers could calculate intercept points with reasonable accuracy. For dive bombers, like the Val, which could transition from level flight at 10,000 feet to a 70-degree dive in seconds, then pull out at 1,000 feet and escape at wave-top altitude, intercept calculations became guesswork. The time delay between firing a shell and its detonation gave Val pilots multiple opportunities to evade. They would see the first shells explode, note the altitude of the barrage, and simply adjust their dive profile to avoid it. If the barrage was set for 5,000 feet, they would hold their dive until 4,000 feet before releasing their bomb and pulling out. If the barrage was low, they would release early and accept slightly reduced accuracy rather than fly through the explosions. The US Navy understood they had a critical problem. Modern carrier-based dive bombers were too fast, too maneuverable, and flew attack profiles that made accurate time fusing nearly impossible. What gunners needed was a fuse that would automatically detonate when a shell came within lethal range of an enemy aircraft, regardless of the aircraft's altitude, speed, or maneuvers. They needed a proximity fuse. The concept was not new. Multiple nations had explored proximity fuses since the 1920s. Every attempt had failed because the engineering challenges seemed insurmountable. To work effectively, a proximity fuse needed to sense when it was near a target and detonate automatically. That meant incorporating some kind of electronic sensor into the nose of an artillery shell. But artillery shells experienced forces that destroyed conventional electronics instantly. When fired from a 5-inch naval gun, a shell accelerated to 2,800 feet per second in the length of the gun barrel. That created a setback force of 20,000 times the force of gravity, 20,000 G-forces. Simultaneously, the rifling grooves in the gun barrel spun the shell at 25,000 revolutions per minute to stabilize its flight. Any electronic components inside the shell would be subjected to crushing acceleration, violent rotation, and impact forces that would pulverize ordinary vacuum tubes into glass powder and metal fragments. Then, there were the practical requirements that made the problem even harder. The fuse needed to be small enough to fit inside a standard artillery shell. It needed to be reliable enough for mass production. It needed safety mechanisms to prevent premature detonation that could kill friendly gun crews. It needed to be weatherproof, stable in storage for months in tropical heat and Arctic cold, and cheap enough to manufacture by the millions. It needed to work in rain, fog, and darkness, and it needed to be simple enough that ordinary sailors could handle it safely without specialized training beyond basic ammunition procedures. German scientists had been working on proximity fuses since the early 1930s. By 1944, they had explored more than 30 different designs, including acoustic fuses, triggered by engine sounds, electrostatic field detection systems, and radio frequency circuits. None worked reliably. The acoustic fuses were too sensitive to background noise. The electrostatic fuses couldn't distinguish between targets and ground clutter. The radio fuses required vacuum tubes that German engineers concluded could not survive artillery gun firing. In 1943, German weapons development agencies formally reported that building a vacuum tube-based radio fuse for artillery shells was technologically impossible. The acceleration forces would destroy the tubes before they could function. The problem could not be solved with existing technology. British scientists reached a different conclusion. Starting in 1939, researchers at Pi Limited began developing ruggedized vacuum tubes that could withstand high acceleration. By 1940, they had working prototypes of proximity fuses for unrotated projectiles, which was the British cover name for solid-fueled rockets. Rockets had relatively gentle acceleration compared to artillery shells, so the electronic components faced less stress. The British fuses worked adequately in rockets, but attempts to adapt them for high-velocity artillery consistently failed. The tubes shattered. The circuits malfunctioned. The fuses were unreliable under combat conditions. In August 1940, a British technical mission, led by Henry Tizard, arrived in the United States carrying a black metal deed box containing Britain's most secret military technologies. Among the items in that box were circuit diagrams and prototypes of British proximity fuse designs. The British hoped American industry could solve the manufacturing problems they could not overcome alone. The Americans could bring industrial scale, engineering talent, and manufacturing capacity that Britain, fighting for survival against Germany, could not spare. The National Defense Research Committee assigned the Proximity Fuse project to Section T of the Department of Terrestrial Magnetism at the Carnegie Institution in Washington. Section T was led by Dr. Merle Tuve, a physicist who had helped develop the theoretical foundations for radar in the 1920s. Tuve understood that the core technical challenge was not the concept, but the execution. Radio proximity fuses were conceptually simple. A miniature transmitter in the nose of the shell would emit radio waves. When those waves reflected off a nearby target, a receiver circuit would detect the reflected signal and trigger a detonator. Simple concept, extraordinarily difficult engineering. Tuve assembled a team of physicists and engineers and gave them an impossible deadline. The Navy needed working proximity fuses for 5-inch anti-aircraft guns as soon as physically possible. Japanese air power was destroying American ships across the Pacific. Without an effective anti-aircraft defense, the Navy could not operate in contested waters. Tuve's team had months, not years, to solve problems that had stumped British and German scientists for a decade. The team included some of the brightest minds in American physics and engineering. Richard Roberts and Henry Porter conducted experiments on circuit designs. Robert Broad worked on receiver sensitivity. Harry Diamond and Wilbur Hinman from the National Bureau of Standards developed fuse designs for rockets and bombs. The collaboration brought together academic researchers, government scientists, and industrial engineers in ways that had never been attempted before. Every member understood they were racing against time. American sailors were dying in the Pacific while they worked. The first breakthrough came from Lloyd Berkner, one of Tuve's engineers. Berkner developed a system using separate transmitter and receiver circuits instead of a combined transceiver. This simplified the electronics, and made the system more reliable under combat conditions. But the vacuum tube problem remained unsolved. Standard vacuum tubes shattered under the acceleration forces of gunfire. The glass envelopes cracked, the filaments broke, the tube elements came loose and destroyed the circuits during firing. The solution came from an unexpected source. Western Electric Company and Raytheon manufactured miniature vacuum tubes for hearing aids. Hearing aid tubes were already ruggedized for portable use in devices that experienced vibration and temperature changes. They were small, mechanically robust, and used relatively little power. Working with TÜV's specifications, Western Electric and Raytheon engineers modified hearing aid tube designs to survive artillery gun firing. They reinforced the glass envelopes with thicker walls. They redesigned the filament mounts with shock-absorbing structures. They tested the tubes by firing them from air cannons into solid blocks of wood, subjecting them to acceleration forces, far exceeding what they would experience in actual combat. Most tubes failed. The engineers redesigned them, tested again, failed again, redesigned again. By January 1942, after months of iterative testing and redesign, they had vacuum tubes that survived 20,000 G-forces and 25,000 RPM spin rates. The tubes were tiny, barely larger than a rifle cartridge. Each proximity fuse required 5 of these miniature tubes, along with resistors, capacitors, a battery, safety mechanisms, and a detonator. All of this had to be packed into a space smaller than a beer can and weigh less than 2 pounds. The battery system alone presented enormous challenges. Standard batteries could not withstand the firing shock. Engineers developed a reserve battery that was activated by the setback force of firing. A small glass ampule containing electrolyte would shatter when the shell was fired, mixing with the battery plates and activating the power supply. This elegant solution ensured the battery remained inert during storage and transportation, eliminating safety concerns about live electrical systems in ammunition storage areas. The safety mechanisms required equally innovative solutions. The fuse needed to remain completely inert during handling, transportation, and loading into the gun. It could not arm until the shell had traveled far enough from the ship to protect friendly forces and nearby vessels. Engineers designed a complex system using mercury switches that required centrifugal force from the shell's rotation to close, combined with a timer that ensured at least 0.3 of a second elapsed after firing before the fuse could detonate. This meant the shell had to travel at least 750 feet from the gun before it became active. Even if a shell misfired and fell near the gun crew, it would remain harmless, just another dud round to be disposed of safely. In early August 1942, the Navy conducted the first live fire test of proximity-fused shells in the Chesapeake Bay. The cruiser USS Cleveland fired at radio-controlled drone aircraft on August the 12th during its shakedown cruise. The test was scheduled for 2 days. It ended after 1 day because all the drones were destroyed. The gun crews aboard Cleveland fired 4 shells. 3 drones were destroyed. 1 drone survived only because no shells were fired at it. Navy observers present at the test were astonished by the results. The proximity fuses worked perfectly under combat conditions. For the first time in history, anti-aircraft gunners could reliably hit moving aerial targets without achieving direct hits. The shells just needed to pass within 70 feet of the target, and the proximity fuse would detonate automatically, shredding the target with shrapnel. The improvement over time-fused shells was so dramatic that some Navy officers initially suspected the test had been rigged or that the results were somehow misleading. But subsequent tests confirmed the initial findings. The proximity fuse represented a genuine breakthrough in anti-aircraft warfare, but successful testing and combat deployment were very different challenges. TÜV's team needed to scale up from prototype production to mass manufacturing on a scale never before attempted for electronic devices. By January 1943, Section T had moved from the Carnegie Institution to a much larger facility and been reorganized as the Applied Physics Laboratory under Johns Hopkins University, with TÜV as director. The project now involved 26 contractors and 10,000 workers. More than 100 American companies contributed to proximity fuse production, including General Electric, RCA, Raytheon, Sylvania, Westinghouse, Eastman Kodak, Zenith, Philco, and even Wurlitzer, the organ manufacturer. Each proximity fuse contained 130 miniaturized electronic components. Assembly required precision work beyond anything attempted in consumer electronics production. Workers at factories across America built these fuses without knowing what they were building. Security was absolute. The project had the same classification level as the Manhattan Project developing the atomic bomb. Workers who asked what the fuses were for were told only that they were critical to winning the war. Many workers never learned the truth until after Japan surrendered. The Crosley Corporation in Cincinnati, Ohio, became one of the largest proximity fuse manufacturers, producing 5.2 million units, roughly 24% of total wartime production. The company converted its barrel organ factory into a fuse assembly line. General Electric's Christmas tree lamp factory in Cleveland was retooled to produce miniature vacuum tubes. Eastman Kodak, RCA, and Sylvania joined the production effort. At peak production, American factories were manufacturing more than 100,000 proximity fuses per week. The fuses that cost $732 each in early 1942 cost just $18 each by 1945. That price reduction reflected both improved manufacturing efficiency and the economies of scale that only American industry could achieve. In November 1942, the Navy shipped 5,000 proximity fuses to Pearl Harbor. The Pacific Fleet received 4,500 of them and began distributing them to ships operating in the Solomon Islands campaign. But the fuses came with strict restrictions that frustrated every commanding officer who received them. They could only be used over water, where dud shells would sink to the ocean floor beyond Japanese recovery. If a fuse failed to detonate and fell on land, Japanese engineers might recover it, reverse engineer the technology, and develop countermeasures that could devastate American air operations across the Pacific. The risk was considered too great to authorize land use under any circumstances. On January 5, 1943, those restrictions were tested in combat for the first time. Lieutenant Red Cochrane commanded Helena's aft 5-inch battery that morning when 4 Japanese Vals attacked the task force. The gun crews had minimal time to aim. The aircraft had already completed their attack run on the attached New Zealand cruiser Achilles and were climbing away at high speed. Traditional doctrine said to let them go. Time-fused shells fired at departing aircraft rarely achieved hits because calculating the correct fuse setting for a rapidly changing range was nearly impossible. But Cochrane had proximity fused shells. He ordered his guns to fire 3 salvos at the departing Vals. All 3 shells exploded in the air. The lead Val disintegrated and crashed into the sea. Helena's crew had achieved the first confirmed kill of an enemy Japanese aircraft using a proximity-fused shell in combat. It was not a lucky hit. It was repeatable technology. Over the next 12 months, the effectiveness of proximity fuses in naval combat became undeniable. In 1943, Navy ships fired 9,128 proximity-fused rounds and destroyed 61 enemy aircraft. That was 1 kill for every 150 shells fired. Time-fused shells required 2,500 rounds per kill. The proximity fuse was more than 15 times as effective. And this was just the beginning. As gun crews gained experience with the new fuses and fire control systems improved through integration with radar tracking, the kill ratios improved dramatically. By 1944, the number of proximity-fused rounds fired climbed to 32,826, accounting for hundreds of aircraft destroyed. During the Marianas Campaign in June 1944, proximity-fuse 5-inch shells provided critical air defense for carrier task forces operating deep in Japanese-controlled waters. During the Battle of the Philippine Sea, known to American pilots as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, American ships equipped with proximity fuses shot down numerous Japanese aircraft attempting to attack the carriers. The Japanese naval aviators, among the most experienced pilots remaining in their fleet after 2 years of attrition, found themselves unable to penetrate the defensive screen created by proximity-fused anti-aircraft fire. One Navy study concluded that previously 5-inch guns had needed to fire approximately 1,000 time-fused shells to destroy one enemy aircraft. With proximity fuses, that number dropped to about 250 shells per kill, a 4-fold improvement in effectiveness. The impact was not merely statistical. The proximity fuse fundamentally changed the tactical equation for Japanese naval aviation. Before proximity fuses, Japanese dive bomber and torpedo bomber pilots could rely on their skill and aircraft maneuverability to evade anti-aircraft fire. They would approach at high altitude where time-fused shells were inaccurate, then transition to their attack dive at a moment calculated to minimize exposure to defensive fire. If they timed their approach correctly and executed their dive precisely, they had reasonable odds of surviving long enough to release their ordnance. Proximity fuses eliminated that calculus. American ships created defensive zones extending thousands of yards from their hulls. Any aircraft entering that zone faced a statistical probability of destruction that approached certainty. The shells did not need to hit the aircraft directly. They just needed to pass nearby. A near miss was as lethal as a direct hit. Skilled pilots found their training and experience counted for nothing against weapons that detonated automatically at optimal range. Japanese dive bomber tactics had been perfected through years of training and combat experience. Val pilots would approach their target in a shallow descent from high altitude, conserving speed and maintaining formation discipline. At a precisely calculated point, typically when the target ship was at an optimal angle, the formation would break and individual aircraft would roll into steep dips. The dive angle for experienced Val pilots could reach 70 degrees, nearly vertical. During the dive, the pilot would use the aircraft's gun sight to track the target while the rear gunner monitored altitude and watched for defending fighters. At approximately 1,000 feet above the target, the pilot would release the bomb and immediately pull into a maximum G-turn to escape the target's immediate defensive fire zone. If executed correctly, the entire attack, from dive initiation to escape, lasted less than 30 seconds. The aircraft would be in the most vulnerable phase, the dive itself, for perhaps 15 seconds. Traditional anti-aircraft fire was ineffective against this tactic because gunners could not track the rapidly changing altitude and range quickly enough to achieve accurate time fuse settings. But proximity fuses did not require tracking. They required only that shells pass within 70 feet of the aircraft. A Val in a 70-degree dive was traveling nearly vertically through space. Shells fired at its predicted position did not need perfect accuracy. They just needed to be close. When proximity fused, shells began detonating around diving Vals. Japanese pilots discovered their carefully practiced tactics had become death sentences. They could not evade shells that exploded automatically when they came close. They could not outmaneuver shrapnel that filled spheres of space 70 feet in radius around each shell burst. The psychological impact on Japanese naval aviators was severe and immediate. Pilots who had survived multiple combat missions against American ships suddenly found themselves facing a new kind of defensive fire that seemed to anticipate their every maneuver. They would roll into their attack dives, expecting the familiar pattern of time-fused shells exploding at fixed altitudes below them, only to find shells detonating at precisely the altitude they had chosen for their attack run. They would attempt evasive maneuvers during their dive, only to discover that the shells followed them, detonating regardless of how they maneuvered. Japanese pilots began reporting to their commanders that American anti-aircraft fire had become impossibly accurate. Some speculated that American radar had achieved capabilities far beyond what Japanese intelligence believed possible. Others suggested that American ships were equipped with new fire control computers that could predict aircraft maneuvers. None suspected the truth, that American shells carried miniature electronic brains that made targeting decisions faster than any human gunner or computer could calculate. On May 11, 1945, the destroyer USS Hugh W. Hadley was on radar picket duty off Okinawa when more than 100 Japanese aircraft attacked in a coordinated strike. These were not just conventional attacks. Many of the aircraft were kamikazes, pilots who had already accepted death and were flying one-way missions intended to crash their aircraft into American ships. Hadley's 5-inch guns were equipped with proximity fuses. In 90 minutes of continuous combat, Hadley shot down 23 aircraft, setting an all-time U.S. Navy record for a single engagement by a destroyer. Every proximity fuse shell that came within 70 feet of a target detonated automatically, filling the sky with lethal shrapnel patterns that aircraft could not avoid. The nearby destroyer USS Evans accounted for 19 additional aircraft before being forced to retire with severe damage. Together, the two destroyers shot down more than 40 enemy aircraft. Both ships received Presidential Unit citations for this action. The after-action report, filed by Hadley's commanding officer, described the proximity fuse as indispensable to the ship's survival. Without proximity-fused ammunition, the report stated, the concentrated kamikaze attack would have overwhelmed the ship's defenses within minutes. The effectiveness of proximity fuses against kamikaze attacks became even more pronounced as the war progressed toward the Japanese home islands. Traditional kamikaze tactics involved approaching at wave-top altitude to avoid radar detection, then pulling up sharply for a final dive onto the target ship. This gave defending gunners only seconds to engage. Time-fused shells were nearly useless against such attacks because there was no time to observe shell bursts, calculate corrections, and reset fuses for subsequent salvos. Proximity-fused shells created an invisible barrier around American ships that kamikazes had to penetrate. Navy studies showed that ships using proximity-fused ammunition were 5 to 10 times more effective at stopping kamikaze attacks than ships using conventional time-fused shells. Ships equipped with 5-inch 38 caliber guns firing proximity-fused ammunition could create a lethal zone extending thousands of yards from the ship. Any aircraft entering that zone faced destruction with near certainty. Admiral Arleigh Burke, who commanded destroyers in the Solomon Islands campaign in 1942 and 1943, later wrote about the difficulties of defending against Japanese air attacks, especially after dark. Mechanical time fuses, which we had been using, only brought down a plane at night by accident, he recalled in a 1978 interview. They were good for harassing enemy aircraft at night, but that was about all. The proximity fuse changed everything by making nighttime air defense genuinely effective for the first time. In the 7 months from January to July 1945, American ships expended nearly 2/3 of all proximity fuses used during the entire war, shooting down more than 200 aircraft. The proximity fuse allowed the Navy to maintain operations in waters where kamikaze attacks would otherwise have made naval operations suicidally dangerous. The American advance across the Pacific toward the Japanese home islands depended on the ability of the fleet to operate within range of land-based Japanese aircraft. Without proximity fuses, that advance would have been far more costly, perhaps prohibitively so. But the story of the proximity fuse was not just about technology defeating Japanese air power. It was about how that technology came to exist in the first place and why American scientists succeeded where German and Japanese scientists failed. The answer lay not in superior theoretical knowledge, but in superior engineering execution and manufacturing capability. The Germans understood the principles of radio proximity fuses as well as the Americans did. German scientists had explored acoustic fuses, optical fuses, electrostatic fuses, and radio frequency fuses. They had tested dozens of prototype designs. They had access to excellent vacuum tube technology, sophisticated electronics manufacturing, and talented engineers. What the Germans lacked was the industrial capacity to solve thousands of small manufacturing problems simultaneously while fighting a two-front war. American industry in 1942 had capabilities that no other nation could match. The United States was not being bombed. American factories could operate at full capacity without fear of air raids disrupting production. American universities could devote their best physicists and engineers to weapons development without those same people being drafted into frontline combat units. American corporations could invest in specialized manufacturing equipment, knowing that their factories would not be destroyed by enemy action before the investment paid off. The proximity fuse required miniature vacuum tubes that could survive forces no civilian electronics had ever faced. American companies like Western Electric and Raytheon had the manufacturing expertise to modify hearing aid tube designs, the testing equipment to subject prototypes to 20,000 G-forces, and the production capacity to manufacture millions of tubes once the design was perfected. German companies had similar expertise, but they were simultaneously trying to produce radar systems, radio equipment for aircraft and submarines, fire control computers, and countless other electronic systems for military fighting on multiple fronts. They could not afford to invest the resources needed to perfect proximity fuse manufacturing while also meeting demands for conventional weapons. The Japanese faced even greater challenges. Japanese electronics manufacturing in the 1940s lagged behind both American and German capabilities. Japanese vacuum tubes were generally less reliable and less sophisticated than American or German equivalents. Japanese manufacturing processes emphasized hand craftsmanship over mass production, which worked well for producing small numbers of high-quality items, but poorly for producing millions of complex electronic devices under wartime conditions. More critically, Japanese military culture divided research efforts between the Army and Navy with minimal cooperation or information sharing between the two services. This meant that if one service developed a promising technology, the other service might remain ignorant of it or might develop a competing system rather than adopting the existing design. The Americans, by contrast, had centralized weapons development under the National Defense Research Committee, which coordinated research across military services, universities, and private industry. When Section T developed the proximity fuse for the Navy, the system was immediately available to the Army as well, once security restrictions allowed its use. When manufacturing problems arose at one factory, solutions developed at that factory were shared with all other factories producing the same components. This level of coordination was possible only because American industry was not fighting for survival, not being bombed into rubble, and not fragmented by inter-service rivalries that prevented cooperation. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Dr. James Van Allen, who worked on proximity fuse development at the Applied Physics Laboratory and later became famous for discovering Earth's radiation belts, recalled in interviews that the proximity fuse project succeeded because it brought together the right people with the right resources at the right time. The theoretical physics was not particularly advanced, Van Allen said. Any competent physicist could have designed a radio proximity fuse on paper. The challenge was making it work in practice, which required solving hundreds of engineering problems that had nothing to do with physics. How do you make a glass vacuum tube that won't shatter when fired from a gun? That's not a physics problem. That's a materials engineering problem. How do you make a battery that activates only when fired, remains stable at temperatures from -50 degrees to +100 degrees, and provides reliable power for the few seconds the fuse needs to operate? That's an electrochemistry problem. How do you manufacture 130 miniaturized components, assemble them into a working fuse in a space smaller than a beer can, test each fuse to ensure it works, and do all of this millions of times while maintaining quality control? That's a manufacturing problem. The Americans solved these problems because they had engineers who specialized in materials science, electrochemists who understood battery design, and manufacturing specialists who knew how to set up production lines for complex assemblies. They had these specialists because American industry had been developing consumer electronics, automotive electrical systems, and industrial control equipment for decades. The expertise existed. It just needed to be redirected toward military applications. By January 1943, when Lieutenant Red Cochrane fired the first proximity-fused shells in combat off Guadalcanal, American factories were already producing thousands of fuses per day. By late 1943, production had reached 40,000 fuses per day. By the end of the war, production exceeded 70,000 fuses per day from multiple factories. The scale was staggering. Over 22 million proximity fuses were manufactured during World War II. Each one contained 5 miniature vacuum tubes, dozens of resistors and capacitors, a battery, safety switches, and a detonator. Each one had to survive being fired from a gun, had to operate reliably under combat conditions, and had to be safe enough that ordinary sailors could handle it without specialized training. The fact that this mass production was achieved while maintaining quality high enough that most fuses worked as designed was a tribute to American manufacturing capability that neither Germany nor Japan could match. The Japanese never understood what they were facing. Japanese pilots who survived encounters with proximity-fused anti-aircraft fire reported that American defensive fire had become impossibly accurate. But Japanese intelligence never determined why. Japanese commanders speculated that American radar had achieved extraordinary capabilities, or that American fire control computers had made breakthrough advances. Some Japanese analysts suggested that American gunners had simply become much better trained. None suspected that American shells contained miniature radar sets more sophisticated than the radar systems on Japanese warships. This intelligence failure was not due to lack of effort. Japanese forces occasionally recovered unexploded American artillery shells, including some proximity-fused rounds that failed to detonate. Japanese ordnance specialists examined these shells carefully. They noted the unusual components in the fuse assembly. They recognized that electronics were involved, but they could not understand how such electronics could survive the shock of firing, and they could not replicate the miniature vacuum tubes they found in captured fuses. Japanese vacuum tube manufacturing could not produce tubes small enough and rugged enough to fit in an artillery shell fuse. Japanese engineers concluded that the captured fuses must have been designed for a different application, perhaps for use in rockets, which experienced gentler acceleration than gun-fired shells. The closest the Japanese came to understanding American proximity fuses was in late 1944, when Japanese intelligence obtained information suggesting that American anti-aircraft shells used some kind of radio-based fuse. Japanese engineers were tasked with developing countermeasures. They explored jamming systems that might interfere with the fuse's radio signal. They designed radar warning receivers that might detect proximity fuse transmissions and alert pilots to evade. None of these countermeasures reached operational deployment before the war ended. Even if they had, their effectiveness would have been limited because Japanese engineers never fully understood how the American fuses worked. The American proximity fuse transmitted radio waves at frequencies around 90 million cycles per second and detected reflections from targets as close as 70 feet. Jamming such a system would require transmitters operating at exactly the right frequency, with enough power to overwhelm the reflected signal, while mounted on aircraft already carrying bombs, fuel, and defensive armament. Japanese electronics manufacturing in 1945 was struggling to produce basic radar sets and radio equipment. Developing sophisticated jamming systems for proximity fuses was beyond their capability, even if they had fully understood what they were trying to jam. By mid-1945, the Imperial Japanese Navy had largely ceased to exist as an effective fighting force. Most of Japan's aircraft carriers had been sunk. Most of her experienced naval aviators were dead. The remaining naval air forces were assigned to kamikaze missions, one-way attacks where pilot skill mattered less than determination to crash into American ships. Against kamikaze attacks, proximity fuses were devastatingly effective. A pilot determined to die could not evade shells that detonated automatically when they came close. Japanese military planners recognized that conventional air attacks against American ships had become futile. Proximity-fused anti-aircraft fire made it nearly impossible for attacking aircraft to survive long enough to deliver their ordnance. This recognition contributed to the Japanese decision to emphasize kamikaze tactics in the final year of the war. If pilots were going to die anyway, better to ensure they took American ships with them. The statistics supported this grim calculus. Conventional dive bomber and torpedo bomber attacks against well-defended American ships in 1945 achieved hit rates below 10%, while suffering losses exceeding 50%. Kamikaze attacks achieved higher hit rates, sometimes exceeding 20%, because damaged aircraft could still reach their targets even if the pilot was wounded or the aircraft was crippled. A conventional dive bomber hit by anti-aircraft fire would crash into the ocean. A kamikaze hit by anti-aircraft fire might still crash into its target if the aircraft remained controllable for a few more seconds. But even kamikaze attacks face severe attrition from proximity-fused defenses. At Okinawa, where Japanese forces launched the most intensive kamikaze campaign of the war, American ships, equipped with proximity fuses, shot down hundreds of attacking aircraft. The Navy suffered heavy casualties, losing 21 ships sunk and 66 damaged. But these losses came from thousands of kamikaze sorties. Without proximity fuses, the losses would have been catastrophic. Naval planners estimated that without proximity-fused ammunition, the kamikaze campaign at Okinawa would have sunk or severely damaged more than twice as many ships, potentially making the invasion unsustainable. The proximity fuse demonstrated a pattern that would repeat throughout World War II and beyond. Technological advantage in warfare does not come primarily from theoretical breakthroughs or dramatic inventions. It comes from engineering execution, manufacturing scale, and the ability to translate scientific concepts into reliable weapons that can be mass-produced and deployed under combat conditions. The concept of a proximity fuse was well understood by multiple nations before the war began. British scientists had working prototypes. German scientists had explored the technology extensively. Japanese scientists understood the principles. What separated success from failure was the ability to solve thousands of small engineering problems, manufacture components to precise tolerances, and produce complex electronic devices in quantities of millions while maintaining quality control. The United States had the industrial base, the skilled workforce, and the organizational structure that could coordinate work across dozens of contractors and hundreds of factories. Germany and Japan did not. By 1944, American industry was producing more proximity fuses every month than Germany and Japan had produced artillery shells of all types combined. This disparity in manufacturing capability, more than any single technological advantage, determined the outcome of the Pacific War. Japanese forces fought with skill and determination, but they could not overcome American industrial superiority. Every proximity fuse shell that detonated near a Japanese aircraft represented not just one destroyed plane, but the accumulated capability of American industry to design, manufacture, and deploy technology at a scale no other nation could match. The Vals dive bomber that fell burning into the Solomon Sea on January 5, 1943, was among the first Japanese aircraft destroyed by proximity fuse fire. Over the next 30 months, thousands more would follow. Japanese pilots continued to fly combat missions with the same skill and courage they had demonstrated at Pearl Harbor. But skill and courage could not overcome weapons that detonated automatically at optimal range. The Vals, which had sunk more Allied warships than any other Axis aircraft during the first year of the Pacific War, became increasingly ineffective as proximity fuses spread through the American fleet. By late 1944, Vals were relegated to secondary theaters where American naval forces were less concentrated. By early 1945, remaining Vals were assigned to training units or converted for kamikaze missions. The aircraft that had terrorized Allied shipping from Pearl Harbor to the Indian Ocean ended the war as training aircraft or suicide weapons, testimony to how completely proximity fuses had changed the tactical equation. The Japanese never developed an effective counter to proximity-fused anti-aircraft fire. They never reverse-engineered captured fuses successfully. They never understood that American shells contained technology their own engineers had declared impossible to build. Dr. Merle Tuvey, who led the development of the proximity fuse, never received widespread public recognition for his work. The project remained classified until after Japan surrendered. Even after the war ended, Tuvey was reluctant to discuss his role. He understood that Section T had solved an engineering problem that saved thousands of Allied lives, but he also knew that many people at many organizations had contributed to that success. The proximity fuse was not the work of a single genius. It was the product of systematic collaboration between physicists, engineers, manufacturers, and military personnel across dozens of organizations. Over 22 million proximity fuses were produced during World War II by more than 100 manufacturers. That scale of production required contributions from thousands of people, most of whom never knew what they were building. After the war, Tuvey returned to the Department of Terrestrial Magnetism at the Carnegie Institution and served as its director from 1946 to 1966. He continued research in geophysics and radio astronomy. In 1948, he was named an honorary commander of the Order of the British Empire for his service to the Allied cause during the war. President Harry Truman awarded him the Presidential Medal for Merit, but Tuvey rarely spoke about the proximity fuse. When asked about his wartime work, he emphasized the collaborative nature of the project and the contributions of the engineers and technicians who had solved countless technical problems that made mass production possible. Dr. Merle Tuvey died on May 20th, 1982, at the age of 80. His obituaries mentioned his contributions to geophysics and his leadership of the Applied Physics Laboratory during World War II, but most did not detail the specific work he had done on proximity fuses. The technology had been declassified for decades, but it remained obscure outside military and technical circles. Tuvey himself had never sought publicity for his wartime work. He believed that scientific achievement should be measured by results, not recognition. The proximity fuse had saved lives and helped win the war. That was what mattered. The Applied Physics Laboratory that Tuvey founded continues to operate today as a research facility of Johns Hopkins University. It conducts work in national security, space exploration, and advanced technology development. The building in Silver Spring, Maryland, where Section T first assembled proximity fuses in 1942, no longer stands. It was demolished decades ago and replaced by commercial development. There is no memorial marker at the site. Nothing identifies it as the place where one of the war's most important technologies was born. The workers who assembled proximity fuses in factories across America went back to their peacetime jobs when the war ended. Most never learned exactly what they had been building. The soldiers and sailors who benefited from proximity-fused ammunition rarely knew the technical details of how the fuses worked. They just knew that anti-aircraft guns were suddenly much more effective and that Japanese aircraft were falling from the sky in unprecedented numbers. The technology remained mysterious even to the people whose lives it saved. The Japanese pilots who died in attacks on American ships equipped with proximity fuses never understood what killed them. Their families received notification that they had died in combat, but the notifications did not explain that American shells had contained miniature radar sets more sophisticated than anything Japan had been able to build. The pilots died believing they had been defeated by superior American gunnery or better radar, not understanding that they had faced a weapon their own scientists had declared technologically impossible. The The Japanese engineers who examined captured proximity fuses after the war were astonished by what they found. The miniaturization was extraordinary. The ruggedization was beyond anything they had attempted. The manufacturing quality was exceptional. They recognized that they had been defeated not just militarily, but industrially. American factories had produced millions of these devices, while Japanese industry struggled to manufacture basic electronics in thousands. The scale of American industrial capability, demonstrated in the proximity fuse program, helped convince Japanese leaders that continuing the war was futile. This is how wars are won, not through dramatic last stands or heroic individual actions, but through systematic application of industrial and scientific capability. The proximity fuse succeeded because Section T could draw on the resources of American industry, the technical expertise of academic researchers, and the practical knowledge of Navy ordnance officers who understood what combat conditions would demand. It succeeded because Western Electric and Raytheon could manufacture ruggedized vacuum tubes that no one had built before. It succeeded because factory workers across America could assemble complex electronics at scales that would have been impossible for any other nation. And it succeeded because Lieutenant Red Cochrane made the decision to use the technology when it mattered most, trusting that American engineering had solved problems that had defeated every other nation that tried. The story of the proximity fuse is the story of American industrial and scientific power at its peak. It is the story of what becomes possible when talented people are given clear objectives, adequate resources, and freedom to innovate. It is the story of collaboration between universities, government laboratories, and private industry on a scale never before attempted. And it is the story of a technology that saved thousands of Allied lives and changed naval warfare forever, developed by people whose names are mostly forgotten today. The 4 Japanese Vals dive bombers that attacked the USS Helena on January 5, 1943, represented the cream of Japanese naval aviation. Their pilots were experienced combat veterans who had flown missions from Pearl Harbor to the Coral Sea. They understood dive bombing tactics as well as any pilots in the world. They flew aircraft designed specifically for precision attack against naval targets. But when they encountered proximity-fused anti-aircraft fire that morning, their skill and their aircraft design counted for nothing. One Val fell burning into the sea, destroyed by a weapon that detonated 70 feet away without requiring a direct hit. The other 3 escaped it, but they carried back reports of impossibly accurate American anti-aircraft fire. Those reports reached Japanese naval intelligence, where analysts struggled to explain what had changed. They knew American anti-aircraft fire had been ineffective in 1942. They knew that American gunners had needed thousands of shells to achieve single kills. They could not understand how American anti-aircraft effectiveness had suddenly improved by an order of magnitude. The answer lay in a device smaller than a beer can, containing miniature vacuum tubes that had been designed by American physicists, engineered by American companies, and manufactured by American workers who never knew what they were building. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.